This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I am a historian of emotion. It's a slightly strange thing to be, and I'm going to spend the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'll try and be relatively quick since we're slightly behind schedule, we all need to incorporate some more caffeine. For the next 35 minutes or so, explaining what it is to be a historian of emotions, and I'm going to compress about 20 years of my own research into the next kind of 30 minutes. I've never attempted before, so I wish you luck in incorporating that. I run a research centre for the history of emotions at Queen Mary, University of London. There are several, you may be surprised to learn, centres for the history of emotions around the world. There's one in Berlin, there's a massive one in Australia spread out at several universities, and then there's our one here in London, having run since 2008. Most recently, we've just started a new Wellcome-funded project, which is a collaborative humanities and social science project called Living with Feeling, Emotional Health in History, Philosophy and Experience, trying to use humanities research to think about what it is to be emotionally healthy in the modern world, and you can read more about that on our website. My title today is called Anatomizing the Emotions, because I think of what I do as a historian as pulling apart these extremely complex mental states into their sort of components, a little bit like this famous painting of anatomy lesson, pointing to the different parts and pulling them away from each other. So an emotion, as we all know, is a very, very complex lived experience. It includes our body, it includes our thoughts, it includes language, it includes moral values. We've already heard all these things spoken about just this morning. And so historically, I want to look at the histories of those things and tease them apart to show how they come together to form these very strange and complex mental states. Now, I'm going to start with something of a caricature of what I call the Ekman-Pixar theory of emotions. So this is the background against which I see myself starting my historical, critical work. So I'm going to oversimplify what is already a slightly oversimplified view of emotion. And most of you in this room will be familiar with what I'm talking about here, but maybe not all of you. And you may not all have seen this excellent movie, the Pixar movie Inside Out. So, as we've already heard from Giovanna this morning, there are various theories of basic emotions. The idea that all human beings in all times and all places have always had the same repertoire of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 basic emotions. And as is already been suggested by the fact there are all these differences of opinion about how many there are, it's not necessarily a completely secure and convincing theory. And I want to look at it from the point of view of history and to use history to criticise and to challenge the idea that there might be these fixed basic emotions. So just, who has seen Inside Out? Okay, so about a third. So I'll give you a really quick plot summary of the movie Inside Out. It's about an 11-year-old girl called Riley, and she's very traumatised when she moves home from Minnesota to San Francisco, and we see this process and this story through this team of 5 emotions who had a sort of control panel inside Riley's head, headed up by Joy, the one in the middle who's kind of in charge. But as the movie goes on and the story gets more sad and difficult, it becomes clear that Riley, the little girl whose head this is inside, needs all her emotions, not just joy, and especially sadness, pictured here, comes to have a particularly important role. So there's quite a valuable message here about emotional health, actually, which is that it's good to feel lots of different feelings, that we shouldn't expect to be happy all the time, that it's good for children to learn to feel sadness and to be with it and to express it. So that's all quite good. But what I want to look at is this underlying idea that there are all these basic emotions that we all share. And the person, without any doubt, has done by far the most to popularise this idea is Dr. Paul Ekman. Not pictured here. This is Tim Roth playing the character Dr. Cal Lightman in the TV series Lie to Me, which has this character. I have to confess I've not actually even seen it, but this character is based on a Paul Ekman type forensic psychologist. And through TV series like this, extremely popular, as well as his own books and website and his training systems you can sign up for and pay to learn to get better recognizing micro-expressions and so on. Paul Ekman's really cornered the market in basic emotions. And a few years ago now, I tried myself out on his website to go and see if I could do it, to see, well, if these are basic emotions, I should be able to recognize all of them. And one of the several interesting facts about his system is how weird the pictures are that he uses to train people with. I was discussing this with a colleague last night. They're posed emotional faces. So I guess the key features of the Ekman technique in much of his work has been that these posed photographs of actors, I don't think they can't even be professional actors, I don't think, of people posing emotion faces, which are then shown to experimental subjects who are given a forced choice between a small number of English language words. So you match the posed face to a small number of words. And you can go and do this online. I said this is a couple of years outdated. There are online versions where you can try and go and do it. Now, I don't know as you can see from the wrong, I got this one wrong. So I did this game, so can I match them up? What do you think that is?
Fear.
Fear? Disgust? Fear. Most people think fear. Now, let me check. I think that's correct. I think I guessed disgust and contempt before I finally guessed fear. But fear is the, quote, correct answer for that one. That one I got wrong as well.
Contempt.
Yeah, so I guessed contempt on that, and that was wrong. Then I guessed disgust, and that was wrong. It turns out the answer to this one is happy. I feel sorry for that.
She's got a smiley face.
And this one, I finally got one right. Disgust, okay. So disgust is generally thought to be one of the more easily distinguishable ones, and so I finally got that one right. Now, perhaps I'm a particularly bad reader of emotions, perhaps this is particularly flawed set of photographs, but I'm using this as a shorthand for there are problems with this method. So let me come on to what it is that I do, as I think of as anatomizing the emotions, pulling apart the historical bodies, places, beliefs, narratives, the cultural stuff of collective memory that holds our emotions together. I suppose the one big idea I want to highlight at the outset is that it seems to me that what we believe about our emotional experiences, what I as an individual bring to that experience, is not a secondary interpretation of something that my body just gives me in an automatic way, but rather those beliefs are constitutive of the experiences themselves. The language and the beliefs, if you like, to extend the body metaphor, are the skeleton, the bones of the experience. They're not the kind of outer skin of it. So, as I put up here, as you can see on the PowerPoint, there are 4 ways in which I want to look at the anatomy of emotions historically. First of all, the history of the psychological categories that we use to think about affective states. Secondly, the entanglement of scientific method with moral political values when we're trying to study emotions. Thirdly, the history of the body, we've already heard about it this morning. And fourthly, changing emotional regimes, or you might call them affective styles that Giovanna was talking about. And in all these cases, I'm going to summarize a little bit of research that I've done myself. So, if you remember one thing from this talk, and indeed from my whole academic career, it should probably be this. This is my contribution to human knowledge, limited though it may seem, which is that before the kind of early to mid-19th century, people didn't really talk about emotions in the way that we do today. So if you look at ancient philosophers, early modern philosophers, early scientists, medics, they talked about the passions, the appetites, the affections of the soul. They talked about sentiments and feelings. If they wrote a systematic treatise on the subject, it would most likely be called The Passions of the Soul. And to talk about the emotions as a coherent psychological category about which we might theorize only really comes into existence with the birth of modern psychology in the second half of the 19th century. So that's the punchline, and you can daydream for the rest of the talk. But the emotions didn't exist before the 19th century. And in my writing on this subject, I tried to use that historical insight to suggest that that word embodies in it, that category embodies in it, a set of modern psychological assumptions and methods which change and define the very thing that is being studied. The emotions from the outset, I guess there's just two things I'll emphasize here, were detached from moral and theological discourse in which the passions, appetites and affections used to be discussed. So the emotions was a scientific term used primarily by the early psychologists like Alexander Bain, Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin, writing in Britain in the mid-19th century. So that word from the outset became a secular and psychological way of dividing up the mind. And secondly, which also slightly harks back to Inside Out and the picture of the human mind in that film, emotions from the outset were these little kind of atoms, these self-contained entities that did things in our minds and bodies independently of what had used to exist, namely the faculties of the mind such as the will, the conscience, reason, intellect, which used to be the ruling faculties of the mind, through which passions and sentiments and affections were experienced. The emotions have become these sort of autonomous agents in their own right. And I can say more about that later if people want. So those are two of the kind of headlines I want to emphasize about the transition from passions and affections to emotions. And you can read much, much more than you could possibly want to in my 2003 book on the subject, or I recommend instead the quite short 2012 article on the subject, published in Emotion Review, called Emotion, the History of a Keyword in Crisis. The history of emotions is not an entirely new discipline, although it's only recently come to be practiced quite so widely as it is today. And one of the people that inspires me in the way that I think about this is a French historian who was working in the 1930s and 40s called Lucien Febvre, who first really put forward the idea that we should use history to rethink the psychology of emotions. And one idea I take from him is that there's nothing so anachronistic as psychological anachronism. He calls it the worst sort of anachronism and the most insidious and harmful. He says the science of contemporary psychologists can have no possible application to the past. Now that may be going a bit too far, but the basic point is that human mental life is brought into existence through a complex system of thought, theory, reflection, as well as the human body living in human social life. And to take a psychological theory that might work for the 21st century and expect it to apply to the way people experience themselves in, let's say, the 12th century would not be a realistic thing to do. Finally, under the heading of psychological categories, the category that I'm now researching is anger. This, as you will know, is quite topical. Giovanna alluded to the emotion or mood of being depressed about the world in general, which I think we can all identify with every day when we open up the BBC News website. But as well as being depressed about the world in general, a lot of people are angry about the world in various ways at the moment. And both the American election and the British referendum result brought out this new politics of anger, and a lot of commentators are now talking about this. So one of the things I want to do in my new project is to get into the deep, both sort of biological and cultural history of anger as an emotion state. Some historians have done this before. There's this book by Carol and Peter Stearns from about 30 years ago, actually, about the struggle for control over anger in American culture. But one thing that Stearns' book takes for granted that I won't want to take for granted is that there is this thing called anger. So it comes back to the sort of basic emotions approach. There's this thing called anger, it's biological, it's linked to aggression in some way, not really specified, and it's a thing that won't change much over time. But what has changed over time in the Stearns' approach is our attitudes to it, our moral judgments about it, the way that we try and inculcate it or don't. Well, I want to go further than that and suggest that anger may not be a coherent thing at all. And to look at the different words, the different concepts, the different theories of anger, rage, fury, irritation, annoyance, bile, and so forth over many centuries to try and problematize that idea as a thing. And as a very preliminary starting point, a gesture towards that, I think there are at least two basic kinds of anger which on the face of it are pretty obviously different. And I'm going to illustrate it in the next couple of slides with quotes from Darwin and Aristotle, respectively. So very simply, there's animal anger and there's moral anger. Animal anger is an automatic response, something with maybe increased heart rate, the face flushing red, perhaps a motivation towards some kind of violent action. And it's the kind of thing that Darwin was interested in his pioneering work on the expression of the emotions in the 1870s. Darwin also wrote about emotions in his very endearing and intriguing portrait of his own child. He wrote a psychological biographical sketch of an infant based on observing in great detail his own son when his first son was born. Something that when I became a father I thought I might replicate well, this would be great, I'll be like Darwin, I'm going to observe all his little moves and emotions, and after a few days of complete and utter exhaustion, realised that I was not going to manage this. I think Darwin had better domestic staff than I did. But this is just a little paragraph he has about anger, and he goes through observing his son, a few days old, a few weeks old, a few months old. And just towards the end, he says, about halfway down, when 11 months old, if a wrong plaything was given to me, would push it away and beat it. I presume that the beating was an instinctive sign of anger, like the snapping of the jaws by a young crocodile just out of the egg, and not that he imagined he could hurt the plaything. So Darwin has there's quite a lot of speculation about what's going on inside this 11-month-old child's mind. But also, his immediate instinct is to draw a parallel with an animal, a young crocodile snapping. And that's an image I'm going to keep with me, I think, the young crocodile snapping, that kind of animal anger. And he goes on to speculate about gender, and to say that young boys seem to throw sticks and books at people, but young girls don't. And I'll be interested to see whether modern science agrees with that. Then the other extreme, if you like, is moral anger. The kind of anger that maybe doesn't necessarily involve any kind of physical arousal at all. The kind of, perhaps, political anger which is more metaphorical or more intellectual, or perhaps also includes the bodily anger, and that's a question that we can get into. And this is one of the earliest analyses of anger in the whole of Western literature that survives by Aristotle in the Rhetoric. And for him, anger is nothing primarily to do with animal anger or aggression, but it's a highly moralized state. It's about your honour having been impugned, it's about having been slighted or insulted or offended by somebody. And central to moral anger for Aristotle is the desire for revenge. Not only that, the sweetness of the pleasure of the desire for revenge. So reading Aristotle was one of the first things I did thinking about this, and immediately thought, well, that's not what I mean by anger. I mean by anger when I've had a hard day and I lose my temper and I don't know, throw something across the room in frustration at the world. I'm not feeling slighted and offended and seeking sweet pleasure of revenge like I'm in a sort of classical tragedy. So this is just the first attempt at getting at what are the different sorts of anger, and do we recognise them and do we feel them or not? Okay, speeding on. Entanglement of science and values. So I'll be really quick on this, partly because it's obvious, but partly to leave a bit of some other things too. Okay, two more works from the Dixon oeuvre there. My second main research project was about the invention of altruism, so we looked at the invention of emotions. Altruism turns out also to have not existed before the 19th century. And so I suppose this is history of emotions, again in a conceptual sense. I was looking at different ways that people understand love. Altruism is a form of love. It is love for our fellow humans. It is self-sacrificing love of others instead of ourselves. The word was coined by the increasingly mad French sociologist Auguste Comte in the middle of the 19th century as part of his religion of humanity. He thought we should all love one another as a replacement for Christianity. We should have a religion of humanity, a literal religion where you sing hymns about humanity, you have saints, and so forth. Fascinating part of intellectual history. But he invents this word altruism. He says it's the thing we should all aim towards. So right in the beginnings of the science of altruism, you have this religious moral side to it, which is the reason Auguste Comte is interested in it, is because he thinks we should all be cultivating it for religious and moral reasons. And we jump now to the 1970s, and I guess the most famous scientific theorist of altruism in the popular mind, not Margaret Thatcher, but Richard Dawkins. Or has Margaret Thatcher too. And I mean, the reason I put them next to each other is there was a perception both at the time and afterwards that this scientific book, this popular science book about the selfish gene, and the fact that deep down we are robots programmed by selfish genes, had some resonance, some connection with the politics of Thatcherism, that somehow this was backing us up, or justifying it, or reflecting the ethos of the age through popular science. So this is again about our ideas about basic human feelings and the scientific study of them being tied up with political and moral assumptions. Actually, Richard Dawkins has been quite confused on the subject of what is the relationship between his claims about human instinct and broader moral ideas about altruism. And essentially, his view changes completely between the selfish gene in 1976 and the God delusion in 2006. The selfish gene, he says, has tried to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. So our genes are selfish, they make us selfish, and therefore we have to teach our children to be generous and altruistic. That actually, even in 1976, I think, was a misunderstanding of his own theory. And then by 2006, I think he'd become more consistent and accurate in terms of what he was trying to say, which is altruism is quite natural, is a blessed misfiring. So altruism evolves through whatever there'll be debates about, whether kin selection, group selection, whatever, it evolves. And then even when we live in these big complex societies where we're living with people who are not related to us, we still can't help ourselves being nice to them. And that's why it calls it a blessed misfiring. We're behaving to everyone as if they are our kin. So it would make sense if we live with our kin, but we don't. But why does he say it's a blessed misfiring? That's my question. That's not a scientific judgment. Why does he think it's good that we behave like that? He doesn't say. And Charles Darwin is guilty, if guilty is the right word, of the same sort of thing. Trying to have his sort of objective cake and morally eating it at the same time. So he's written a scientific book, The Seventh Man, about evolution and morality, but he ends up sounding a bit like a clergyman, saying that as evolution goes on, we'll get more and more sympathetic, our social instincts will become more developed, and he says virtue will be triumphant. It's a moralistic judgment. So summarising all of this, I guess I'm trying to draw attention to this paradox. That on the one hand, scientists themselves in writing will strenuously state that what is natural is just the way it is. It's not what it ought to be. What is natural is different from what is ethical. And yet, on the other hand, scientific accounts for that very reason are extremely ethically and politically powerful. Because you can say, look, this is science. I'm speaking in the voice of nature. So Richard Dawkins can say, look, I don't want people to be selfish and competitive, but I'm afraid, that's what science shows that we are. So there's that paradox and that tension. And the recent books on the science of altruism from a few years ago now are kind of doing the opposite of Richard Dawkins' fame from the 1970s. They're saying altruism is natural and it is a good thing. So we should emulate nature, and that means being more altruistic, mothers and others, and the genial gene by Joe Rothko. Okay. Third, the body. So we've looked at values, looked at concepts and categories. The human body is obviously a huge part of what it is to be emotional and have emotions. We've heard quite a bit about that from Giovanna already. My own turn towards the body came in the form of researching the history of tears and weeping, which obviously extremely embodied activities. This book, Weeping Britannia, came out last year, which traces the history of Britain through British tears over 600 years. It seemed like a good idea at the time. So it's a series of sort of vignettes of different British weepers over the centuries, religious, political, sporting, public, private, male, female weeping, and using it to tell a sort of historical story about the changing emotional or affective style of Britain over the centuries. And this is a nice little counterpart to the Italian gestures that we saw a minute ago. This is the British stiff upper lip and the history of it, and how did we come as a nation, if we did, to be so repressed, and what's happened more recently. And so that is looking at the way that British bodies have behaved, and what it has meant for British and English people to experience their bodies behaving certain ways. And again, as with most of my work, Darwin has featured quite centrally, and this is from Darwin's book on the emotions, 1872. He says, with the civilized nations of Europe, there's also much difference in the frequency of weeping. English men rarely cry. These are the three words that first got me into this topic. As a weepy Englishman, I thought, okay, well, what's going on here? Except under the pressure of the acutest grief. Whereas in some parts of the continent, you Italians, I guess, the men shed tears much more readily and freely. And he goes on then to say also savages, as he likes to call them at the time, uncivilized people are even more all over the place in terms of their emotions, laughing and crying with no control whatsoever. So that's one sort of staging post, the Darwinian view. And he sees this as a racial and biological thing. There's a sort of hierarchy of races, and the white European races are more able to contain their emotions. So one of the many images of infants weeping. His book is notable also being one of the first scientific books to use photographs. It's a little book in 1872. He uses these photographs. If this is an actual infant actually crying, unlike those Ekman photographs of amateur actors posing. Although actually Darwin has some hilarious photos of actors posing as well. So I suppose the main point here is about how the body responds in a way that incorporates its culture and incorporates cultural expectations. And we now know, this is a recent recent moment from British TV that some of you may or may not recognise. The Great British Bake Off, a kind of iconic moment of modern British emoting. Weeping is commonplace now on television. We live in a new age of sensibility. Showing and talking about our feelings is much more de rigueur. Even male Tories show their emotions on TV these days. That's 2010, David Cameron talking about the tragic death of his son and welling up on camera, and then George Osborne at the funeral of Margaret Thatcher, shedding a tear, about which he was grilled on national radio as to why was he weeping at a funeral by the inimitable John Humphreys on the Today programme. Was this the kind of thing he usually did? So, while history changes, it changes quite slowly. There are still people at present who feel that a man should not shed a tear at a funeral. So that takes me to the final theme of changing emotional regimes. So the historical changes in what people think is an appropriate and good way to express emotions, which has a long and complex history. And as I've said before, let's emphasise again, I think that our beliefs about what is appropriate and our beliefs about what our emotions show about us are a part of the experience of having and expressing that emotion. If I think that I shouldn't cry in public, then crying in public is a quite different subjective experience than if I think it makes me feel really great if I can. And so again, back to my new topic of anger. One of the books that I'm going to be studying and writing about is this one, which is interesting for many reasons. It's an anthropological study by Jean Briggs, published in 1969 or 1970, based on a research visit she made to a remote Eskimo tribe, pictured here, the Utku, on Back River in the 1960s. She lived with them for quite a long time, months, maybe even over a year. She first arrived there as an anthropology student wanting to study shamanism. She'd heard that they were a shamanistic culture. And she got there and thought, I don't quite understand how this happened, days before internet or smartphones or even telephones. And she got there and said, I'm here to study shamanism. They said, oh, no, we're all Christians now. We don't believe in shamanism. So she had to find a different research topic. And she chose the emotional dynamics of this culture. And wrote this fascinating, real kind of page-turning book about the emotions. And the point about the book is called Never in Anger. So she experienced this culture as one in which it was not acceptable to express emotions much at all, but especially not to express anger. And so this is interesting to me for various reasons. Interesting to suggest that there's a great deal of cultural variation in the experience and expression of anger. Suggests it may not be as universal as some people might think. Alternatively, it's also part of the history of the way that Western and scientific writers talk about primitive or other cultures. And sometimes those texts are portrayed, as Darwin did, other cultures as more emotional, more uncontrolled. But in other cases, there's this sort of history of the noble savage, and the idea that these are noble and stoical kinds of people who don't show their feelings because they're so sort of strong and hardened. So there's a complex history of the way that we, in Western civilization, compared ourselves with other civilizations in order to shape and understand our lives and understand our own emotions. So, doing quite well there, almost at the end. Just draw everything together for the last few minutes. So this comes back to the Centre History of Emotions at Queen Mary that I direct. I just want to mention the work of some of the other people there and some of the things that we do. I'm really pleased to be here because one of the things that we most want to do is to have these conversations with scientists and psychologists and philosophers and others. So that's one thing that's really important to us. The other thing that we try to do as much as possible is engagement, public engagement of various kinds. And one of the projects we've done is a thing called the Carnival of Lost Emotions. And it's about emotions that used to exist but don't exist anymore. So like the medieval feeling of akidia, or the 19th century idea of hypochondriasis, and various different emotional and psychiatric states that people used to experience and no longer do. And the thing on the right is actually a physical object which one of my students commissioned by approximately to get made. This is the emotions machine. It's a bit like a kind of TARDIS, and you can choose which year you want to go to, and then they use this as the basis for sort of talks and performances about lost emotions to sort of dramatise the idea of emotions from the past. And here's some of the team in costume acting out emotions from the past. Another book I know some of you already know about, by my colleague Tiffany Watt-Smith, the book of Human Emotions, is a sort of popularisation of this whole area that I'm talking about. and it goes through 150 or 160 different emotions, some familiar, some from other cultures that we've never heard of, some from the past, which are lost and forgotten. Again, just to try and get across this idea of the diversity and difference that culture and history bring to emotional experience. And I'll finally talk about a project that I did some years ago in an Osmani primary school in East London, near Mile where I work, where I went into schools and I showed them historical faces, so images from 18th and 19th century texts of science and physiognomy that allegedly showed the expression of various passions and emotions. And I asked them just to respond to them and said, what do you think this person is feeling? I didn't do a false choice of, it must be the anger, sadness, etc. I just said, what are they feeling? And they come up with a free response, and I've written that up in a report that you can read online. But I wanted to end with this general thought arising from some of my experiences in that school. And that is that I think, as a historian of emotions, in a way I want to have it both ways. I want to say that there is an almost indefinite potential for diversity in terms of the ways that we experience and feel our affective states, the way that we understand them, and that there's something very limiting and unsatisfactory about the basic emotions model. But on the other hand, I want to say that we can study the emotions and feelings of human beings in the past and in other cultures and have some sense that we know what it is that we're studying, and some sense of connection and identification. I read the Confessions of St. Augustine, 4th century African Christian with whom I have little in common, and I feel like this man understands what it's like to be me. He understands the trials and tribulations of human passion and frustration and so on. So I'm trying to say both things at once. On the one hand, there's a huge variety. On the other hand, there is something that links human feeling to human feeling across time and across culture. And in line with that, I think my own historical research has borne that out. That some things are very, very resilient to historical change and don't change very much. And one of those is the belief that women are more emotional than men, and girls are more emotional than boys, and that girls cry more and women cry more. Now, not only is that stereotype incredibly deeply ingrained in Western culture and history, it's also still prominent today, even though we live in what one might hope would be a culture that was more free from that kind of stereotype. But also, empirical scientific studies in all different cultures around the world have all found, with maybe a couple of exceptions, that women cry more frequently than men, and they cry more than men. And that's probably normally based on self-report, so it could be that women simply own up to crying more than men, but I think it's also based on actual observation, measuring frequency and duration of crying bouts. So that's interesting. And I came across this same belief in Osmani School in East London when I asked the children at one point to take a whiteboard and draw a picture of an emotional scene. And one of them drew this, which says, "Girl all day cry." So embodying nicely that not particularly enlightening stereotype about girls crying more than boys. But then, as I said, on the other hand, and hopefully I've given you a flavour of this already, it seems to me that through the changing bodily rituals, the changing beliefs about the mind, changing ways of studying and understanding the mind, changing moral values that inform the way we experience our bodies and emotions, the changing social regimes that tell us what's good and what's bad in emotion, I think there is genuinely a case that there is a huge diversity of the way that we can experience emotions, and that history not only changes how we label and interpret our feelings, but changes our feelings. It changes the repertoire of human emotions available to us. And I'm going to end with this quotation from Thomas Cogan. Thomas Cogan is a totally obscure 19th century physician, but he wrote this rather nice thing encapsulating what I want to end on, this thought that I just said about diversity. So he said, "But the diversities of opinions and manners, with their corresponding predilections and aversions, exceed enumeration. It is these diversities which furnish the amusement derived from the perusal of travellers, and as no two nations on the globe correspond in every instance, the peculiarities of each illustrate in a striking manner the truth of our observation. They indicate the inconceivable variety of sentiments and affections which incidentally take place among beings of the same species, inhabitants of the same sublunary system, conversant with similar objects, and possessing similar powers of mind." And I suppose that the humanities approach to the emotions can sometimes counterbalance the scientific quest for universality by reminding us about this infinite diversity, or almost infinite diversity of states of feeling. And to put it more succinctly, as one of the children at Osmani School did, she said, I think that we should all feel like differently. She held up this sign, so I'll leave it there.